All right, welcome everybody back for the next edition of our Hogan Distinguished Speaker Series. It is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Sandra Matz. She is an assistant professor at the Business School at the University of Columbia. She has a Bachelor's of Science with distinction from Albert Ludwigs University in Germany. She received her PhD from Cambridge University in the UK at the world-famous Psychometric Center. She, by training, is a computational social scientist, which basically means she does work that bridges psychology, computer science, experimental methods, including a number of things using big data analytics. And she's going to talk about some of that today. She's also known for her research measuring personality using digital footprints, and she's going to talk a little bit more about that today as well. And also she's done some really fascinating research, which I hope she talks about today, on the effects of targeted marketing. That is how we can use your personality to do targeted marketing towards you, which I think is creepy and interesting. So her work has been published in some highly prestigious journals, including the Proceedings of the National Academy of the Sciences, Psychological Science, and the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. She has more than 500 citations, which is really impressive because this is your second year as an assistant professor, including more than 270 last year, right? So last year alone, her citation count doubled, which tells you the kind of track that Sandra is on. Her work has also been featured in Forbes, The Independent, BBC, CNBC. If you Google her, you can find several videos of her readily giving talks to people all around the world. So we are really thrilled to have Dr. Matz here today, and please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks, Ryan, for the introduction. I should say that a lot of my citations actually come from the paper that Ryan accepted, so I'm showing my gratitude now. No, but it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. Also, I guess hi to the millions, I'm sure, people watching this on YouTube. At least, I'm sure there's like 50 more, no, just one person who's probably watching. Hi. I recently figured out that apparently at Columbia we're at this very center of business, which sounds ironic because obviously we're all academics who don't really know much about business. So it's nice to be in a real company that is doing real stuff, like real people, real impact. So what I'm trying to do today is really give a little bit of a snapshot overview of some of the work I'm doing. I've entitled it Using Big Data to Study Individual Differences and Decisions in the Wild. So it's really this idea that we're looking at individual differences, mostly personality, mostly Big Five, as you'll see, and see how that plays out in the real world, looking at online data as a means of assessment or online behavior as a means of assessment, and seeing, so I was already terrified when you said, I hope she's going to talk about this study. I am luckily going to talk about this study. So really also looking at, okay, how can we use some of these predictions that we're making to influence behavior or to change behavior? And whenever I give this talk in various places to convince people that it's not just me who thinks this is really cool, and there's this quote from The Economist that says, the web will revolutionize social science just as a microscope and a telescope transform the natural sciences. So it's really this idea that we can now look into people's lives, not just by giving them questionnaires, but really by looking at what is it that they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And if we just look at a few numbers, and really you can look at so many different things to see the scale of this, like in just 1 minute, and we know that there's about 4.2 million searches made on Google, and on Facebook about 500,000 comments are posted. So again, this is roughly the time it takes me to get through the slide. It's a tiny fraction of time. On YouTube, about 48 hours of content are shared, and then on Amazon, there's a bunch of items being sold. So the amount of data that we're producing now is insane. About 2.5 quintillion bytes of data produced every day, which is a 2.5 with 18 zeros. So it's almost impossible to imagine how much data we're producing on really like a day-to-day basis. Which also incredibly exciting for social scientists, for personality psychologists, because that really now gives us this window into people's psychology. So we can learn a lot about their preferences, what is it that people do on a day-to-day basis. cases. And that's what we're trying to leverage in the context of assessment, in terms of understanding or answering some of the questions that psychologists, but also like a whole bunch of other social scientists have been interested in traditionally. So the way that I've structured that talk is really kind of trying to share with you my perspective on how we can use some of the big data, some of the stuff that's out there to study those questions, those social science questions. Because there's obviously this huge hype around, oh my god, everybody should now use big data, but the question is really, okay, like how should we use it? Like how can we leverage the fact that we know so much about people and to really drive the questions that we're interested in? And the way that I like to think about it is basically that if you, like in the context of individual differences, you can either use it as the output, and I think that's something that if you think more in terms of like economics and political sciences, people have already started doing, like for decades really, looking at people's actual behavior. In psychology, and especially when it comes to individual differences, usually we kind of give people questionnaires to ask them about the choices they make, or we have them kind of do our little controlled experiments where they have to press buttons. So the idea is really that now we can study what is that people actually do as an outcome. We can then flip it and say, okay, people leave all these traces, these digital footprints, can we use it to learn something about their psychology? So this is the part that Ryan mentioned, is kind of going more into the direction of assessment. So can we, for example, take someone's Facebook likes, their transaction records, their smartphone sensory data, and make predictions about their psychological traits, so personality, for example, but also their psychological states, such as mood and personality states. So this is really just the flip side. And then I think the part where it gets really interesting is when we combine the two and we say, okay, we take someone's digital footprint to learn something about their psychological profile, so for example, using Facebook likes to predict their personality traits, and then again, in turn, we use these insights to either change behavior, influence behavior through psychologically tailored interventions. And that's the part where I'm going to focus on probably the most, which is really saying, okay, now that we have all these methods, can we, for example, increase clicks and conversions in marketing campaigns on Facebook? So this is the part that Ryan mentioned, and that I think is the most interesting one, because it really means that we can now study individual differences at scale, which we couldn't really do before. Okay, the theoretical framework that I'm using, and I'm not going to go into too much detail at all here, I just want to use it to set up some of the questions that I'm looking into, is this idea of psychological fit. So we know from various kind of contexts that people like to surround themselves with others that are similar psychologically. So we have friends who are similar in terms of us, like our personality. We also have partners, usually, that are at least to some extent similar to us. Work environments, this is something that I'm sure most of you will be familiar with, is that people usually thrive in environments or jobs that match their psychological profiles. And this is also true for residential locations, so we know that people usually cluster in terms of their personality. That could be in cities, that could be in neighborhoods, could be in entire countries. And we also know that people tend to prefer products or tend to spend more money on things and that match their personality. So the last thing is really something that I want to start with, because that was one of the original projects that I got interested in. And it's one of the projects that takes big data as an output. By the way, if you have questions along the way, I'm happy to also take them throughout instead of having just one Q&A at the end. Okay, so starting with kind of taking big data as an outcome, so measuring individual differences the way that we've always measured them using questionnaires, but then looking at their actual data, in this case it's transactions, as an outcome. So the question that I was interested in, and this was the first paper, that got published, so I'm kind of, it's close to my heart. The question was, does spending money in a way that fits our personality, does that do anything for our life satisfaction? And where I was coming from is that there's all this research showing that spending more money, earning more money is not really strongly related to higher levels of life satisfaction, at least above a certain threshold. And one of the ideas is, well, maybe it's not just about the money itself, maybe it's about what you do with it. And personality theory, again, if we think about the theory of psychological fit, would suggest that maybe if you manage to spend it in a way that matches your fundamental psychological motivations and needs, maybe that's one way of gaining a little bit of life satisfaction here. And the setup was, we teamed up with a bank in the UK, like an international bank, And we managed to send out surveys to their customers, so we kind of gave them a personality questionnaire, life satisfaction questionnaire, and then we also asked them for access to their transaction data for the 6 months prior to the survey. So we knew at point T1, we had all their personality, we had the life satisfaction, and basically the 6 months prior to that, we also knew what they spent their money on. Now, the question, again, that we were asking is whether this fit between the personality of a person and the personality of their spending would do anything to their life satisfaction. And if you think about it in terms of measurement, there's a few things that we have to measure here. So one is just like the personality of our customers, which is the easiest part, so we're just using a Big 5 measure. In this case, a very short one. It's probably not one of your favorite questionnaires because it's really short, not the greatest psychometric properties. But it's really something if you work with companies, then you just have to keep it short. It's better than nothing. It just adds noise. So use this. The second thing, and this is where personality psychologists become a little bit more skeptical, is like how do we measure the personality of our spending? It's actually, if you look at the context of consumer behavior, consumer research, there's quite a bit of evidence that we can use similar scales to what we have in human personality, and we can simply ask people if this spending category was a person, which characteristics would it have? So, and what we know is that people actually have a relatively good reliability in terms of like, people, for example, perceive entertainment as extroverted across the board, so it's not that people vary a lot in terms of their perceptions. And those are just two categories that I picked to show that the ratings actually have relatively good face validity. So in this case, we asked 200 people on MTurk to give us their opinion. And you can see entertainment, which is the blue one, is high on extroversion, high on openness, and relatively low on conscientiousness. If you compare that to books, you see same high on openness, which makes a lot of sense because it's intellectual, but also high on conscientiousness, high on agreeableness. So those generally have pretty good face validity.
What would be the example of a neurotic purchase?
I think neuroticism is actually one of the interesting ones, because there we're not entirely sure in which direction it goes. Neurotic purchases, for example, were traffic fines, for example. So it's not really a purchase, but it's something where like, okay, maybe people were neurotic.
Oh, I think they're paying off cops.
Okay. We unfortunately did not detect any of the bribes. I think, but that's actually a good point. So what we see, because some of people are asking about, okay, this is just the credit debit card spending that we observe. Like in our data, it was, I think 2% of the spending was ATM withdrawals. So like people spend most of their money using credit debit cards. So we unfortunately cannot observe bribes, but most of people's spending is captured here. Okay, now we kind of measure the personality of the product, personality of the person, and now the question is, how do we conceptualize fit? And there's many different ways of doing that. I'm just showing you one that we use in the paper, which is Euclidean distance. But we kind of tried a bunch of other distance similarity measures, and the results are, just have to believe me, are pretty similar. So the way that I like to think about it is if you think of the Big 5 as a 5-dimensional space, I'm not going to show you 5 dimensions because that's very hard to visualize. So we're just going to go with 3, but you can basically plot the person in that 5-dimensional personality space. And then you have all of the categories where the person spent money on. So that person spent money on travel, pops, health, music, and books. And at least in this analysis, so we also show that people spend more money on things that match their personality, which is when we look at individual categories. In the second question, we're really mostly interested in what does their overall shopping behavior look like. So what we did is we calculated the variable that we call the shopping basket, the personality of the shopping basket, which is really just the average of all the other categories. And then you can just look at the distance. So the further apart those two are, the more dissimilar the person is to the way that they spend money. And we've reversed it so that we actually get a fit measure. So everything that I'm going to show you is higher scores mean higher fit and smaller distance. And what we find is support for our hypothesis that the higher the fit, the better the fit, and the higher life satisfaction. You can see that the effect is pretty tiny, so it's not a strong effect, which is not very surprising because we're really using these 6 months of transactions to predict life satisfaction at this very kind of specific point in time, which means that we don't have any issues of common method variants, which you usually get when you ask people questions, and it's a pretty messy design. So the fact that we're finding anything is actually a good indication that there must be something going on, which is true for most of big data studies, by the way. Now, interesting, and that's in line with previous research, is we don't find any effect of income and total spend, so it really seems to be the case that it's about this fit with spending and someone's needs and preferences rather than just how much money you have overall or how much money you spend in total. Now, as we all know, if we've taken a stats class at some point, this is all nice because we're using actual transactions, but we cannot say anything about causality because it's just correlational. So what we did in this case, and the reason why I always mention this study is usually people say, oh, big data, this is like all great and it sounds fancy, but really you can't do anything about causality. And my response is always, well, nobody stops you from doing a follow-up where you can actually test causality. So we can find a pattern out there in big data, and then we can always go back to the lab, follow up with an experiment that allows us to talk about causality or study some of the mechanisms. So what we did in this case is, that was when I was still at the University of Cambridge, so we invited a bunch of people to the lab, so we had pre-screened them on the big five, and we just invited the top third and the bottom third of extroversion to the lab, so we had about 80 participants. We gave them a baseline questionnaire for happiness, which is the PANA scale, so just positive negative affect, and then we randomly assigned them to a condition where they either got a voucher for the student union bar or for a bookstore in Cambridge. And then we had 3 more measures of happiness, and once they received the voucher, they cashed the voucher, so we had briefed the staff at the bookstore and the union bar that if you had seen a specific voucher, I could give them a questionnaire immediately, and then they were forced to at least stay in the bar for 30 minutes or read the book for 30 minutes before completing the final questionnaire. And what we did, for the sake of simplicity, is we just aggregated all of these measures to get a general idea of consumption happiness. Now, if we look at the results, so what you see here is the change in positive affect to baseline. So before they knew anything about the study, how happy were they, and how did that change? So everything that's above the dotted line means that they got happier, everything below means that they got less happy, and the matching condition in green, mismatching in red. So if we just look at the book condition, you can see that the matching condition increased satisfaction compared to the mismatching one, but they actually were happy, relatively happy in both conditions. So even extroverts gained a little bit of happiness in that condition. It's always nice to get free stuff, so not necessarily unexpected. What's interesting is if you look at the bar condition, you can actually see these effects that go in a different direction. So extroverts got happier when they went to the bar, and those poor introverts who were forced to have fun with their friends, they got less happy. So we see and what you see is also that the effect here is much, much stronger. So again, if we're taking it to the lab, we're doing controlled experiments with extreme groups, you actually go back to the size of effects that you would usually expect. Okay, so this is really just looking at big data as an outcome. Now, if we're flipping it, and I don't want to go into too much detail here because I know that Michał Krzyński is coming at some point. He was really one of the pioneers in the field, and I'm sure he's going to tell you a lot more about this. I just want to give you a rough overview of some of the relationships that we find and a rough idea of how we're doing this, because that's what we need for the final part where we talk about the Facebook targeting. So what we know by now is really that pretty much any digital footprint that you can think of, again, that could be your tweets, that could be Facebook likes, that could be your smartphone sensor data, that could be your credit card transactions. So pretty much everything that's out there, all the traces that you leave, can predict pretty much anything that we want to know about you in terms of psychological traits with at least some degree of accuracy. So it really seems to be the case that in pretty much any footprint there is some signal that predicts something about your psychology. So that's personality, values, political ideology, all these different kinds of things. The data set that I'm working mostly, and it's shifted in recent years, I'm now looking at more transaction data and at smartphone sensors, but what most of us in the field started with is this My Personality data set, which was a Facebook app active between 2007 and 2012. And what it did, it just allowed people to take real psychometric tests, so the Big Five, IQ, life satisfaction, and then get immediate feedback on their responses. And people really loved it so much that, so this was set up by one of my colleagues, former colleagues at the Psychometric Center, who did it as like a side project during the summer. And people loved getting feedback so much that they shared it on Facebook, it spread, and he got responses of more than 7 million people, basically for free, which is pretty amazing. Like, I don't think this would work again in today's climate. But anyway, the data is there, and what's interesting is that we have all these psychological traits, all these responses to psychological questionnaires, and then for half the people, so once they got feedback, so everybody got feedback, and then they were asked, or users were asked whether they would voluntarily share their data, their Facebook profile data for research purposes. So for about half the people, you have like the responses to the psychological questionnaires, but you also have everything that they do on Facebook. So we have their profile pictures, their Facebook likes, their status updates, you name it. There's like a lot of stuff that's in there. And that's when it becomes interesting, because now you can see, okay, so how is someone's psychological profile related to what they do online, or vice versa? And that's when you can start making predictions that go from here, so what is it that someone does online, to what does that mean for their psychological profile? And again, I don't want to go into details about like the machine learning behind it. Oftentimes it's not as complicated as you might think. So you can easily use simple regressions in maybe slightly more complicated framework where you cross-validate, but it's not that magical as many people make it sound. So if you're interested, I encourage you to just look into it. Not that complicated, but what I want you to show is that really the results that we see, if we look at like it on the simplest level of correlations, have really good face validity. So those are the words that are most strongly correlated in people's Facebook status updates with being extroverted and introverted. So it's not the frequency, so it doesn't mean that extroverts always talk about love party, amazing weekend. It's just that if you use one of these words, you're more likely than the average person to be extroverted. And you can see there's like pretty big differences, and that make a lot of sense. So extroverts talk about all the social, exciting stuff, and then introverts, much more reserved and quiet, computer, reading, anime, that's all stuff that you do by yourself, not necessarily the most social activities. The next one is one of my favorite word clouds, word of warning, has some pretty strong language. So this is agreeableness. So people hide. And again, and we're not cherry picking. So some people are like, oh, you're just kind of showing the words that are the funniest. Like, no. And again, it also doesn't mean that disagreeable people swear all the time. This means that if you swear on Facebook, your chances of being low on the agreeableness trait is high. But a good face validity, and that's true for most of the traits that we predict, is that oftentimes you show the word clouds and people can immediately guess which trait that is. Now we can do the same thing for Facebook likes. I'm just going to show you an example here. Again, extroversion, introversion. And you see introversion, all this computer stuff that you do by yourself, extroversion. And when I say, that's something I should say and I usually forget, is when I talk about Facebook likes, what I mean is just official, like liking an official Facebook page. So it's liking CNN, it's liking whatever, the official page of Lady Gaga. It's not when one of your friends posts a cat video and you like it. Because for that, the matrix that we get is just way too sparse, so we just don't have enough data points. So Facebook likes in this case means liking an official Facebook page, and you can see that all the extroverted pages also make lots of sense if you link it back to the characteristics of extroverts. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I'm sure that Miho is going to talk about this, but like one of the questions that you usually get is like, how accurate is it? And all I want you to show you is that it's basically getting more accurate as we go over the years. But one of the important things is that also what we want to do is we kind of want to have a baseline comparison, and what we compare it to is usually the retest reliability of a short questionnaire. Because we know that like questionnaires themselves are not 100% reliable. So if we're predicting questionnaire responses, really the ceiling that we can hit is the retest reliability of the questionnaire. And when they started making those predictions. So this is just looking at Facebook likes. Now, when they started, you can see the accuracy in terms of the correlation between the actual self-reported personality scores and the computer-based predictions. So that's just a correlation. And was still relatively low, 0.3, which is better than nothing, but still not great. They used some slightly more sophisticated methods in the next paper, already pushed it up to like slightly higher than 0.5. And again, like if you think of this in terms of variance explained, it's actually a huge jump. And the latest paper, I'm not sure if it's ever going to be published, because that was a grad student who just left, and I'm not sure if we're ever going to publish that. But there's like a few things that we did here, for example, predicting dislikes, which is not enough functionality on Facebook, but you can do in a statistical way, or predicting individual items instead of the aggregate score. We were actually able to push it almost up to the point where it's now as accurate as a short personality questionnaire. Again, I'm sure that Miho is going to say a lot more about this, but the idea is that over the years we actually kind of increased a lot in accuracy, and we're now at the level where on average, and again the problem is that this doesn't necessarily hold for individuals, but on average we're actually pretty accurate with the predictions that we're making. Now, one of the things that's also interesting to look at is, okay, like maybe we're not perfectly predicting the self-reported scores that people give us, but maybe if we use, say, our computer-based prediction of extroversion, maybe that predicts other external outcomes that we want to predict to the same level of accuracy, or even higher. So those are just like external validity results where you can see you have the correlations with self-reported extroversion and the computer-based predictions, and most of the time we see roughly the same correlations with the scores that we get from self-report. Say we want to see how extroversion is related to life satisfaction, we take our self-reported score, and the correlation that we get from the self-reported score and the computer-based score are roughly the same when we compare it to external criteria. So that's just another way of thinking about accuracy. One of the things that we're currently working on, it's a lot more complicated and it's a little bit of a pain because it involves computer vision, like audio processing, and also natural language processing, but we're looking into application videos to see whether we can predict something like personality. So stay tuned, hopefully at some point this is going to come out as well. Okay, so now I'm moving to the final part, which is hopefully the part that's among the most interesting ones, where we really take people's digital footprints as an input to make predictions about their psychological profiles, and then use these profiles in turn to try and influence their behavior. So this is also a paper that's already published and created a lot of buzz in the context of Cambridge Analytica because it's pretty much the science behind it. And the questions that we asked, and there's two questions, and I'm only going to show you the results of one study, the one that's already published, is if we go back to the literature and we think about like fit in the context of consumption, what we know from lab studies is that people, first of all, prefer products that match their personality, but then also that people are more easily persuaded if they are shown messages that are tailored to their personality. So you can imagine that depending on whether you want to talk to an extrovert, you might use different words, you might use different kind of persuasive strategies to convince that person to do something, as opposed to an introvert, as opposed to someone who's open-minded. So we kind of did, what I'm going to show you is mostly focused on the second part, the message matching. You just have to take my word, and it also works in the context of product matching. Now, up to now, like in the second part, everything I've talked about was basically saying, okay, once we have access to someone's like online profile, to, for example, all of their Facebook likes or whatever they post on Twitter, we can make an accurate prediction on the individual level. So we can take your Facebook likes and we can turn it into a psychological profile just for you. Now, most companies don't necessarily have access to people's Facebook profiles, and they also don't have access to the models that they need to turn it into profiles. So one of our questions was, can we use the idea behind it, like the correlations between certain footprints and certain personality traits, to use existing applications and existing targeting mechanisms? Now, if we think back, likes is something that I showed you were certain likes that are strongly predictive of extroversion, likes that were strongly predictive of introversion. And what you can do now, and this is just a snapshot a screenshot of the Facebook targeting platform. So anyone who has a Facebook account can run Facebook ads. And you can see you can target people based on the usual demographics, age, gender, location, but you can also target them based on interests. And now what we can do is we can say, okay, like if I want to target extroverts, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put those likes in the section or those interests in that section that we know are strongly correlated with extroversion. And by doing that, I'm telling Facebook, okay, I want my ads to be only shown to people who are connected to at least one of these likes. And by doing that, I assume that we're going to show my ads to a group of people who's more extroverted than the average group of people. So again, in this case, we're not making any predictions on the level of the individual. We're just saying that this group of consumers, like this audience, whatever we want to call it, has a higher chance than the average to be extroverted. And we weren't sure whether that was actually going to work because it's very little information that we're using. So we did a little pilot test, like a validation test if you want, where we actually on Facebook targeted people with extroverted likes and introverted likes, and we sent them a link to a questionnaire. So we told them, okay, like why don't you take this free questionnaire and get feedback on your responses. And what we wanted to show is exactly what we find is that actually like the group of people who was targeted with the extroverted likes got on average like higher extroversion scores than a group of people who was targeted with the introverted likes. So that was just like a check for us to see whether the manipulation in terms of targeting is strong enough if we're doing it at the group level, not the individual level. Then in study 1, we teamed up with a beauty retailer in the UK, and we advertised their online platform, so their online shop. So the goal was to get people to click on the ad, go to the shop, and purchase something. That counted as a conversion in this case. And what we did is we teamed up with professional graphic designers and copywriters to come up with 5 extroverted ads and 5 introverted ads. So again, I'm just showing you an example here. And the extroverted ads, I think they have we validated them with pretty good face validity, so there's always something going on, it's exciting, there's a group of people having fun. And the introverted ads are always much more reserved, quiet, one person in front of the mirror. Now design, super simple 2x2. We had the 2 target groups, again defined by a list of Facebook likes, and then the different persuasive messages. And our hypothesis was that people in the matching conditions, so introverts receiving introverted messages and vice versa, and that they would click more often and purchase more often. And I'm just going to show you the results for the purchases, because that's at the end of the day what the companies care about. So those were ads that were run on Facebook for seven days, I think. It was a relatively big campaign, so the ad was shown more than 6 million times, about 10,000 people clicked, and there were around 400 conversions. In this case, the overall conversion rates are relatively low because the products were expensive, so on average people spend about £40 per purchase, which is $60. So just forget about the absolute conversion rates. What we're interested in is how they compare across conditions. So again, we have conversion rate on the y-axis, the higher the better, because that means the beauty retailer is selling more, matching and mismatching conditions. And what you can see is that clearly the interaction effect that we were hoping for, that people in the matching conditions are more likely to purchase something. And again, it's a very conservative estimate, because what we're doing is we're not targeting people on the individual level, so we're just defining groups of people in terms of extroversion, introversion, and the only thing that we're manipulating is the ad. So once people get to the website looks exactly the same for everybody, and you can imagine if you were to tailor the entire consumer journey, and these effects might be even bigger. Okay, we replicated this, we're going to go into detail. We just said, okay, let's make sure it's not just extroversion. Let's give it a go with this crossword app, trying to frame it in according to high openness and low openness. We get the same results, again, slightly smaller campaign, but you see that we also find these interaction effects. Now, this is all great for personality psychologists. If you talk to marketing people, they're like, oh, well, it's nice that you do your personality targeting, but we have amazing targeting mechanisms. We use behavioral targeting, and we know that this is great because someone's past behavior is a great predictor of their future behavior. So we're just going to target people if we're thinking about mobile games, for example, who were already interested in other mobile games. And what we told them is, that's probably true. If you already have an affinity with mobile games, you're more likely to kind of download another mobile game. So why don't we keep your targeting mechanism? So we're kind of taking the target likes that you're already using, and we're just trying to understand the psychology of your audience, which in this case, unsurprisingly, mobile games on a phone is also introverted. So we kind of looked at, we mapped all their target likes against my personality data set to say, okay, this is like an introverted audience. And then, similar to what we did previously, we just said, okay, you have your standard messaging. Now we're using your targeting mechanism, so we're using your list of target likes, and the only thing we do is that we adapt the message to be more introverted, because that's the psychological makeup of your audience that is hopefully driving conversions and clicks when it comes to people deciding whether they want to play your app or not. What we see here is also an effect, so using the same behavioral targeting, just one using messaging that is more aligned and with people's psychological characteristics, again boosted the number of installs that we get in this case. Okay, some of the work, it's actually accepted. This is great news. So this is coming out now. But the idea is that like, we're trying to see whether we could automatically predict like how appealing an image is to different types of personalities. So up to that point, we had always involved like creative people to say, okay, just give us a creative, find us the best pictures that we should use for extroverts or introverts. And the question is like, if we just have an image database and we're using computer vision, so we're extracting a bunch of features on, I think we had like 90 features on color, texture, composition, content. Can we automatically predict which images are going to be most appealing to different types of personalities? So we just used a bunch of, not going into detail here, it's like the method that we use. And to some extent that's possible. Just to some extent we can actually say, okay, if we have a picture that has like lots of people, saturated colors, a bunch of other features, this is probably going to appeal to extroverts more than others. And the reason why I think this is interesting is we can already automate this part of the equation, so we can, without giving people a questionnaire, say, okay, someone is landing on my website, we scrape their Facebook, we can tell that this is an extroverted person, and now we can also automatically kind of surface the content that's most aligned with that type of personality. One of the things, and this I just added that because I thought it might be interesting in the context of this group here, is that one of the research that, and this is actually still under review, so that's correct, so that's completely outside of the context of marketing. And the question that we asked is whether if we match incentives to people's personalities, whether they would actually put in more work and perform better on their job. So in this case, we had about 500 salespeople who were selling cars in a car dealership, and we were able to do a randomized control trial. So for some of the people, we matched so there was like this incentive platform where if they had accumulated a number of points, they could just pick their rewards from the platform. And what we did is on that platform, we didn't exclude any rewards. We just said like, okay, same if we're thinking about choice architecture, why don't we put those ones at the top of the list that either match someone's personality or mismatch someone's personality. And what we see here is overall there was actually no effect. So whether we put the matching rewards at the top or the bottom didn't really matter. It did matter for extrinsically motivated people. So you can imagine if you really care about external rewards instead of just being motivated intrinsically, then matching those rewards to your personality actually, in this case, increases car sales. So the outcome was how many cars did people actually sell and how much money did they make for the company. So again, this is just one context where we're trying to show this is not just true for marketing, there's also other contexts in which you could use similar ideas. One of the things, so now we're already moving into the realm of future direction. So one of the projects that I'm currently interested in is to kind of, in a way, like open the hood and see what's happening. If we're talking about psychological fit, where is that coming from? Why do we like things that are similar to us? Why do we like people that are similar to us? And so we're looking at people's brain responses. And in this particular case, we're actually showing that people who are similar in terms of their personality are also similar in terms of how they perceive the world. So if we show them a bunch of images, a bunch of videos, and we measure their brain response, people who are similar in terms of their personality also have a similar brain response when they watch these or when they look at these stimuli. So it's just one way of explaining why we might be seeing these effects and that we see when it comes to matching. Then this is, I'm not sure, some of you might have seen that picture, is the election of the Pope in 2005, election of the Pope in 2013. A very different picture. So in 2005, everybody was just watching, and now everybody is taking pictures. Fun fact that I recently came across is on average per day, people scroll about 300 feet on their phones, which is the height of the Statue of Liberty. So people spend an insane amount of time on their phones. Like, we carry it around with us all the time. Like, we capture the moments that are most important to us. We communicate with people that are important to us. So really, those are all things where we can start moving beyond like relatively stable psychological traits. So everything we've done so far is really saying, okay, you're an extrovert, that's why you get this product, that's why you get this message, you're an introvert, same here. Now we can actually have a much more nuanced picture. So we could, for example, say, okay, we know that on average, like generally you're an extrovert, but right now you're in an introverted situation because there's no ambient noise, you're not moving much, and so probably you're in a situation that's much more quiet and reserved. And maybe, and we don't really know in which direction this is going, but maybe this is the time where we want to target you with advertising because you're missing this extroverted stimulation. Or maybe we're better off targeting you at a point in time when you're actually in an extroverted situation because your self-concept is activated and you're much more open to personality-matched messaging. So again, this is just like one way in which we can now take the context into account and observe like people in context and just get an even better understanding, again, creepy, but an even better understanding of the state that the person might be in. And if like you think this is creepy, I think this is going to get only worse. So I think this is, and it's not really a thing of the future. So Samsung, for example, is already working on those. So those are like smart contact lenses, which not only capture everything that you see, so we're getting a lot more data than just your Facebook likes and Facebook status updates. It captures everything you see, but also then gives you very kind of personalized information in these contact lenses that really, in my opinion, are going to create the ultimate echo chambers. So if you think that Facebook is an echo chamber now, this would mean that we're living in a world where my reality might be completely different to your reality. So I think if we're thinking about ethics, and this is really one thing to watch out for. Again, for social scientists, super interesting, but also for users and part of society, quite scary. And then, of course, and this is just like a few suggested readings if you're interested. Obviously, I've been thinking a lot about ethics and kind of how should we deal with the fact that, like, as a social scientist, might be very interesting, but as a consumer, also incredibly creepy. So there's just a few, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but like thinking around, okay, to what extent can we regulate this technology? To what extent should we regulate it? Like, how much responsibility should we give to the user? Can they actually decide by themselves? Do they have enough knowledge? Are they equipped well enough with all the tools they need to make those decisions? So again, something if you're interested, I would recommend reading a little bit around the context of ethics, because I think it's incredibly important that if we're doing this kind of research, that we're also trying at least to give policymakers and the public some recommendations as to what to do with it. Okay, and with that, I'm done with my part of this thing. I'm super happy to answer questions, which is usually the interesting part for me. So if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Yes.
Did you find that this, all big 5 factors lend themselves to being researched via this? Meaning, do we find that they equally predict or can be predicted equally with your approach?
Yeah, great question. So, answer is no. As you can imagine, the social traits, the ones that are slightly more outward-facing, extroversion, can be predicted pretty accurately. Openness can be predicted accurately. Agreeableness and conscientiousness are usually the ones that are more difficult to predict across the board. So that's Facebook likes, that's language, that's transactions. In the context of the matching, Again, most of our studies have focused on extroversion, and the reason for that is that it's much easier to come up with meaningful things for both ends than for some of the other traits. Like meaningful and positive.
Yeah.
So that's something that I'm usually struggling with is, okay, like how do you come up with a positive framing for low conscientiousness? It's not always easy, and I think that, and that's actually coming back to your first question, neuroticism is the one where we don't really know what to do with yet. Because most likely you don't want a neurotic person to receive a neurotic message, because that's just going to freak them out as hell.
Yeah.
Like you also don't want to recommend neurotic products to neurotic people because they're the last ones that are going to buy it.
Well, I said that the health purchases seem like a neurotic purchase because it's, hypochondriac and all
Yeah.
so.
So I think in that case, it's not so much about thinking of it in terms of matching. It's more like, okay, insurance, for example. Like insurance companies, it's like neurotic people and conscientious, like a combination of conscientious and neurotic that you want, because they're the ones who are most likely to purchase and not claim, because they're also conscientious. Like neurotic people and low conscientious, they're also going to claim. So then it's the question of like, okay, if you have a specific product, and I think that's the beauty of like personality, is people have a very intuitive sense of, okay, if I'm an insurance company, which personality traits might I want to target? For better or worse, to be honest. Any other questions? Go ahead.
So you showed a really big effect for mismatch for low or extroverted, so for introverts.
Yeah.
So it seems that's very critical then if you're going to categorize people, because you categorize someone that is a true introvert as an extrovert, give them extrovert things, the behavior goes the opposite way. So I just thought that was an interesting thing. It seemed like the effect was like, there's a big mismatch effect where extroverts are kind of generally a little bit more happy and satisfied with anything, any action, whereas introverts were very much, if it doesn't align,
I think that's a great point. So one thing that we see is extroversion. So for extroversion, if you compare it to introversion, it doesn't seem to make that much of a difference. So extroverts are happy with anything. They're like optimistic. It's great. Whatever you send their way, it's like they're taking it. It's wonderful. So there's like a much bigger effect of introversion. What we also see, openness, for example. We see the same pattern that, like for low openness, it does make a difference. For high openness, again, like people who are high on openness, they're probably interested in getting a variety of things. So it seems to be the case that some like personality traits, or at least high-low ones, lend themselves a little bit more to that. Which also shows that because we see these effects of mismatching, is that if you get it wrong, there is actually this negative impact. So if we're thinking about accuracy, in the context of marketing, like to be honest, I don't think it matters that much. If you send me the wrong toothpaste, I'm not going to buy it, but it's not going to make my life miserable. If you think of other contexts, recruiting is one of them. If you make the wrong decision, like I think that actually has like really big implications. So that's certainly something to think about. Yes, there's another question.
Have any, in your sort of experience, any companies sort of played with the idea of advertising by saying they won't do this creepy version of advertising, right? Because there's always this flip where they're like, we won't approach you this way because we're this type of company. So it seems like there would be a space for that, and I'm not sure if that's like a couple generations ahead.
Yeah. I haven't seen it like explicitly. I also think there's a danger to it, because like if you make it, it's the same with the experiment of don't think of a white bear, and the first thing you think of is a white bear. So even if companies say we're not doing this, you still to some extent associate them with that technology. So I think that's not necessarily the strategy that I would recommend. I think what I would recommend, either don't say anything, or if you do it, then make it extremely transparent. And say, okay, we know that other companies are abusing your data. We're not doing this. We're actually telling you exactly what we're doing. And if you think that the way that we're using data is going to improve your user experience, then share your data with us. If not, then you don't have to. So it's not this dichotomy where either you use a service and you sell your soul and data, or you don't. It's more like turning it into a value proposition and making it extremely transparent. I think that would be my recommendation in terms of strategy.
I know there's differences across the data that you'll get from different websites or different like methods of collecting stuff, but is there any sort of like general trend where there's like consistencies across them?
I think that's something where we're not doing a good job yet. So we don't usually have data sets, and that's true for companies too, is usually we have like one source of data and we're not really looking too much at consistency. I think that's really like one of the most interesting avenues for future research. Which also I was talking to Ryan earlier, is that I would never get, like, especially in a context of recruiting, I would never get rid of self-report questionnaires, because it kind of gives people the feeling that they actually have some control over what's happening. The company is hearing their side of the story. But I think what is becoming interesting then is consistency. And like one of the studies that we've done right now, and it's not fully what you're asking about, but it's looking at the impact of what we call authenticity. It's like, what is your Facebook likes? What do your Facebook likes say about your personality, your status updates, others, yourself? Like, how does the fit actually predict life satisfaction? And that seems to be the case that the more authentic you are on Facebook, which is kind of in a way going against this idea that everybody's self-enhancing and it's not about authenticity, it's just about whoever has the best profile. So it seems to be the case that there is some benefit of being authentic. But I think in the future we have to do that a lot more, that we combine data sources. Yes?
Yeah, I was going to ask maybe a similar type of question to this authenticity, where it seems like as platforms are used more, they start to develop their own sort of ecosystem or culture, you know, where it's like people engaging with sarcasm or kind of this different way of navigating the culture. And I'm wondering how you're able to kind of address some of those things. Like, you know, I'm married to someone who probably likes Nickelback on Facebook, but he doesn't actually like Nickelback. Right? It's a joke. It's like, oh, hashtag blessed, it's a joke, right? So it's like, you know, aside from ridding the internet of trolls, which I'm all for, I mean, how do you kind of like tap into this maybe disingenuousness or like just the culture of some of those platforms that are designed around something other than authenticity, right?
I think it's a great question. The way that I think about it, and I think there's some people who have a different opinion, but for me it's almost like norming a questionnaire. Mm-hmm. So if I'm collecting data in my ecosystem and I know that, okay, on Facebook, liking Nickelback is, I don't know, predictive of extroversion, maybe not, whatever it is. So that's in a specific context, and in a different context it might be different. And I think what we're doing right now is we say, okay, like this specific word or this specific phrase is predictive of extroversion. We're going to use it as a prior in a different context, but then we're updating the model so that we norm it in that specific context. It's also a question of, it's a question of the ecosystem, but it's also a question of the same way that we sometimes norm questionnaires based on specific age groups or separately for gender. That's also something that I think what we see, and this is actually where some of the jump in terms of accuracy came from, is that we trained the last version of our predictive model using a random forest classifier. I don't have to know what that is, but it just means that you could have, let's take Nickelback, or I always take Justin Bieber. If a 15-year-old girl likes Justin Bieber on Facebook, probably a very different sign or signal than if a 50-year-old guy likes Justin Bieber on Facebook. Either they're willing to Justin Bieber, or it's more of a joke. So in that case, you just have a model that says, okay, I'm first looking at age and gender of a person, and then the weight that Justin Bieber gets for extroversion might be very different than it gets when we're looking at a different demographic group. So it's a great question. Yeah.
Have you done any marketing consulting? Because it seems like you can make a lot of money doing that.
So I think it's a very good question, and what I should say is that usually people ask me, oh, has Cambridge Analytica, the scandal, done anything positive for the field? And my response is absolutely not. So the number of requests I get to do consulting has increased dramatically since then, so there's more and more companies entering the market rather than less. I sometimes do it, and so my condition is always, we're going to do it if it's transparent and if we can publish it. But yeah, there's definitely an increasing kind of number of companies out there doing that.
We have a job open in Hogan marketing.
If I don't get tenure, I'll join.
So you're using Big Five as sort of the nexus, right, for understanding people in the space. And one of the areas that I think is under-researched, and even some of the Hogan people are talking about, is sort of the value frameworks. Mm-hmm. Because in terms of fit, as the model, the value fit should be stronger, especially when you look at some of these traits where it's confusing. And so I'm just curious if you've started to explore any of those frameworks as the nexus for fit?
Yeah, so not necessarily in the context of fit yet. One of the projects that one of my master students was working on is predicting Schwartz values in this case. And if we look at Facebook likes and language, the predictive accuracy seems to be slightly lower than for the big five, which I think is also makes sense because it's not so much like outward signaling, but there is definitely predictive accuracy. And I think you're totally right that we're now focusing on the big five, but depending on the context, I don't think this is the best framework to use. If we're thinking about like political context, whether you want to use it or not, I think values would be more valuable. And if we think about healthcare, for example, like promotion versus prevention could be incredibly interesting. So I think this is like just something that we started with, first of all, because we have the data and because everybody knows the big five. But I totally agree that in some contexts, like I wouldn't go with the big five.
I recently read an article about McDonald's using machine learning and facial recognition to tie their menu to customize it for each person through the drive-thru. Do you think personality science and what you're doing here could help explain some of the behavioral patterns they're using with their machine learning outside of that experience?
I mean, I would be, to be honest, relatively skeptical of like whether personality predicts any food preferences for that purpose. Like the same with facial recognition. Do I really know whether someone wants my strawberry milkshake or the vanilla one? Maybe, but I think the signal that you get there is like relatively low. I think that's probably like more of a marketing thing than an actually predictive. But I don't know, it could be. So there's like a lot more research now on facial recognition, and even in the context of personality, which is what Michal is going to talk about. Sometimes I feel like it's just overhyped and people are like, oh, we also definitely have to have machine learning to recommend what product someone is going to buy at McDonald's. And like, well, really, I don't know. What you could certainly do is, again, then personalize the experience of how you talk to your customer. And I think that's the valuable part. So even if you go give them the same Big Mac, I don't know, you get the same Big Mac, but if I know that you're introverted, maybe the way that I communicate with you is different than when you're extroverted. Because I find it intimidating when people are like all over the place and like super extroverted. As an introvert, maybe then you can just kind of scale back a little bit and kind of talk in a more quiet way. And that's also why I think that personality is super useful, because again, if we're just making predictions of what someone is going to do, we don't really need personality, because it's just like an extra layer where we're adding error. So if you go from past behavior to future behavior, just prediction, that's probably the most accurate, because you don't have this like extra error in terms of going from past behavior to personality error, and then from personality to future behavior, you have like another error. But really where it really becomes valuable is like the communication part, because that's almost impossible to tailor. If I give you 1,000 dimensions of like your past behavior and then tell you good luck communicating with that customer now. So I think that might be one way in which they could use it.
Okay, so
Cookies.
we all have an hour left of the day or the week. So there are cookies and drinks in the back. Sandra's going to stick around in here for anybody who wants to stick around and do more small scale kinds of questions and push some ideas further. But for everyone else, have a good weekend. And the next speaker series, I think, is on the 19th of April. It will be at 3 o'clock, no matter what your calendar says. So if it's wrong, we'll do this again and get it fixed for 3 o'clock. All right, thanks everybody. And please join me.